In a small, devout town, nestled between rolling hills and rivers, lived a man named Pastor Elijah. He was known far and wide for his unshakable faith and strict adherence to Christian values. Pastor Elijah's daughter, Ruth, was the pride of the family. She was intelligent, kind, and devout, a young woman who mirrored the deep faith of her father. Ruth, however, lived under the strictest of rules. She couldn't wear modern clothing, befriend non-believers, or even entertain the idea of love outside of marriage. Though Ruth had grown accustomed to her father's rules, the loneliness of it weighed on her. At campus, she watched her friends live freely, laughing, and sharing stories of love and adventure. But for Ruth, her father's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that the world outside was filled with temptation and sin. One evening, Pastor Elijah invited a young man to stay with them, a guest from another town. His name was David, a devout Christian whom the pastor had mentored and trusted. He was disciplined, well-mannered, and faithful, everything Pastor Elijah admired. David was staying at their home to assist the pastor with an upcoming revival, and Elijah had nothing but high hopes for him. From the moment David arrived, Ruth noticed something different about him. He was gentle but firm in his beliefs, unlike the other men she had encountered. He treated her with a quiet respect, never imposing his views, but always living out his faith. As days passed, Ruth found herself drawn to him, her heart fluttering with feelings she had never experienced before. But she knew her father's rules. Love and romance were not for now, especially not under her father's roof. David, too, felt something. He had come with pure intentions, never expecting to be moved by the pastor's daughter. Ruth's kindness, her beauty, and her quiet strength stirred something deep within him. Yet he was torn. David respected Pastor Elijah too much to betray his trust, and the last thing he wanted was to dishonor the sanctity of their faith. The tension between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. During the day, they would exchange brief glances, small gestures of care. When David handed her a book, their fingers brushed, sending sparks through both of them. At night, they lay awake in their separate rooms, hearts racing, silently wrestling with their emotions, knowing that something sacred could be jeopardized. One Sunday evening, after the church service, a thunderstorm broke out, and the power in their home went out. With the storm howling outside, Pastor Elijah excused himself to check on an elderly member of the congregation, leaving Ruth and David alone in the dimly lit living room. The crackling fire was the only light as rain pounded against the windows. Ruth, feeling a mix of fear and excitement, sat by the fireplace, trying to calm her heart. David stood on the other side of the room, gazing at her, conflicted. The silence was heavy, charged with everything they couldn't say. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ruth, there's something I need to say, something I've been struggling with since the day I arrived." Ruth's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly looked down, knowing they were both walking a dangerous line. "David, please don't," she murmured, afraid of what might happen if they let their feelings come to light. "I can't help it," David continued, stepping closer. "I've tried to bury these feelings, to push them aside because I respect your father. But every time I see you, every time we talk, Before he could finish, the door creaked open, and Pastor Elijah walked in, dripping wet from the rain. He looked at both of them, oblivious to the emotions swirling between them. Ruth quickly stood up and pretended to stoke the fire, her hands trembling. In the days that followed, the tension only grew. Ruth's heart ached with the weight of her unspoken love for David. She knew her father would never approve of a romance that unfolded in secret, and David, though equally torn, would never act against Pastor Elijah's wishes. They were bound by rules, by faith, by a sense of duty that felt both sacred and suffocating. Then came the church revival, the event Pastor Elijah had been preparing for with David's help. It was a gathering of believers from far and wide, and Ruth was tasked with organizing much of the event. That evening, as the church filled with worshipers, Ruth and David worked side by side, never speaking of the feelings that simmered between them. After the service, Ruth found herself alone by the church's old oak tree, the same place she had prayed and reflected so many times before. This time, however, David approached her. "I know this is wrong," he said softly. "I know we can't be together, but it's becoming harder to deny what I feel for you." Ruth looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's the same for me, David. But my father, this life we live, it leaves no room for something like this." David nodded, his heart heavy. Maybe one day, when the time is right, things will change. They stood there, hearts connected in a silent understanding. For now, they could do nothing but bury their love, knowing that it might never be realized. But deep in their hearts, they carried a small hope that perhaps, one day, the rules that bound them would loosen, and they could finally be together.